Why do so many gifted children grow up to feel lost, disengaged, and isolated in their adult lives? They were supposed to be ahead of the curve, weren't they? Celebrated for their intelligence, rewarded for their early achievements, and constantly told they had a bright future. Yet, as time passed, the very things that once made them shine began to weigh them down. Now, many of those same smart kids find themselves trapped in a fog of apathy, social anxiety, and quiet despair. They procrastinate endlessly. They struggle to start or finish projects. They disconnect in conversations or feel like observers rather than participants in life. And despite appearing high-functioning from the outside, still articulate, still competent, there's an aching void beneath the surface. To understand how this happens, we need to go back, not just to childhood, but to the psychology of identity development. When we're young, our sense of self is still soft clay, waiting to be shaped by the hands of experience and affirmation. Children often form their identities around one or two strong labels: the funny one, the athlete, the animal lover. For many gifted kids, that identity becomes the smart one. It starts innocently. A child quickly learns new words, asks curious questions, solves puzzles faster than peers. Parents beam with pride. Teachers shower them with gold stars. Other kids may even start to defer to them in class. And the praise becomes addictive. It builds a script. If I'm smart, I will be loved. If I do well, I will belong. But what seems like positive reinforcement is, underneath, something more fragile. Because over time, these kids begin to conflate their worth with their intellect. They begin to believe, deeply and subconsciously, if I am not exceptional, I am nothing. Here lies the first crack. Intelligence becomes not a tool, but a mask, a shield, a crown. It defines not just how others see them, but how they see themselves. And as with all identities built on conditions, when those conditions change, the whole self begins to tremble. Eventually, life stops catering to easy wins. Middle school, high school, college, they each introduce challenges that can't be solved with instinct alone. Suddenly, effort is required. Studying is necessary. Failure is possible. And this creates a deep internal rupture, because the smart child was never taught how to learn. They were taught how to perform. They were never taught that intelligence isn't fixed. That struggle isn't shameful. That failure isn't final. Instead, they were praised for ease, for solving problems fast, not well, for getting A's without trying, not for the grit of process. So what happens the first time they fail? Panic, shame, avoidance. The very thought of struggling feels like a threat, not just to their grade, but to their very identity. This is the hidden cost of early praise. When success is easy, difficulty feels dangerous. When you're told you're smart for doing things effortlessly, effort starts to feel like a flaw. And so, without even realizing it, these kids begin to avoid effort. They stop raising their hands unless they're sure of the answer. They stop trying new things unless they know they'll be good at them. They opt out of sports, clubs, social risks, anything that might expose their limits. And slowly, their world begins to shrink. Not because they lack ability, but because they've built a self-concept too fragile to withstand uncertainty. As this pattern strengthens, a subtle perfectionism takes root. It's not loud or dramatic. It's quiet and paralyzing. These children turned young adults begin to internalize a new rule. Only do what you're already good at, which means never try, never risk, never grow. This is where the brilliance begins to backfire. Intelligence becomes an anchor rather than a sail. Instead of opening doors, it closes them. Instead of giving freedom, it imposes limitations. And over time, the vibrant curiosity that once made them exceptional fades into passive compliance and quiet fear. They begin to crave validation, but fear exposure. They long to connect but feel inferior the moment they struggle. They avoid feedback, collaboration, and challenge, not because they're lazy, but because they've equated struggle with shame. And so they plateau. And it's not just about careers or academics. This mental model bleeds into relationships, into self-esteem, into daily decisions. So if this is where many gifted kids start to get stuck, how do these patterns evolve? What happens when avoidance becomes chronic? When connection becomes performative? What's the long-term cost of protecting an identity that no longer fits? That's where we'll go next. In part 2, we'll explore how early cognitive identity creates emotional isolation in adulthood, and why so many high-achieving people feel invisible, even in rooms full of people. By the time a gifted child grows into adulthood, the echoes of early identity begin to solidify into quiet behavioral patterns. They no longer feel like choices so much as instincts, invisible walls built to avoid embarrassment, failure, or inadequacy. But beneath these habits lies something far more dangerous than procrastination or perfectionism. It's disconnection, emotional disconnection from others, from one's own feelings, and eventually, from purpose, joy, and meaning. Let's rewind again to the early classroom, the place where many smart kids first learned their strengths. They were praised for thinking fast, speaking fluently, or knowing answers others didn't. But what often went unnoticed is what they didn't learn: how to connect emotionally. Because being the smart one is often a solitary path. It means being in a different lane than peers. It means explaining jokes instead of laughing at them. It means observing others rather than playing with them. And so, early on, many gifted children learn this silent message. Being intelligent sets me apart, but it also keeps me apart. Whether they admit it or not, many of them begin to feel like outsiders, not because they are disliked, but because they feel fundamentally different. They struggle to relate, to sync, to relax into play or chaos. Conversations feel either too slow or too shallow. Emotional expressions in others feel mysterious, even overwhelming. So what happens? They retreat into control. They turn emotions into analysis. They turn curiosity into judgment. They turn relationships into projects, something to solve, not feel. By the time they're teenagers or adults, this detachment isn't visible as loneliness. It often appears as competence. They seem composed, logical, even charming. But beneath the surface, they feel like guests at their own life. They might have friends, but those friendships feel thin. They might be in relationships, but they rarely feel fully seen. And the worst part, many of them don't even realize anything is missing, because they've never known anything different. Here's where things become psychologically nuanced. Intellectual intelligence is not the same as emotional intelligence. You can write an essay about grief and still not know how to feel it. You can name every attachment style and still sabotage every close connection. But when smart children grow up praised for their intellect only, they often develop a kind of emotional atrophy. Not because they're cold, but because their environment taught them that feelings were secondary, that emotional needs were distractions, that tears were for those who couldn't think their way out of pain. So as adults, many of them become masters of avoidance, not of work, but of intimacy. They fear being misunderstood, or worse, fully understood. They may ghost people after one deep conversation. They may prefer texting over calling. They may choose long-distance relationships or emotionally unavailable partners. Why? Because closeness brings exposure, and exposure threatens the fragile scaffolding of their identity. Ironically, many of these individuals still find outward success. They become professionals, creatives, even thought leaders. But success can become another kind of prison, because the smarter they appear, the harder it becomes to admit, I feel alone. I don't know how to connect. I never learned how to be vulnerable. And so, they settle. For polite conversations instead of real ones. For controlled love instead of deep intimacy. For independence instead of interdependence. But underneath it all, there's still that child in the classroom, longing not to be impressive, but to be held. Loneliness, in this case, isn't simply being alone. It's being unseen in the company of others. It's the quiet pain of not knowing how to open your internal world without fear of judgment or shame. And no amount of intelligence can fill that gap, because loneliness isn't solved by thinking. It's softened by presence, by shared vulnerability, by learning how to be, not just how to perform. Many people ask, why do gifted kids become lonely adults? And the answer isn't just social, it's emotional, even spiritual. They've been trained to hide anything that doesn't align with their smart image. That means they hide their sadness behind sarcasm, their fears behind humor, their needs behind independence. And over time, the performance becomes a personality, and the mask becomes a mirror. They look in the mirror and don't even know who they are, just who they're supposed to be. So what happens next? What happens when emotional starvation meets real-world pressure? when the successful smart adult begins to burn out, when they stop chasing praise and begin questioning meaning. That's where we head next. In part 3, we'll explore the inner breakdown, how high-functioning adults unravel from within, and why that unraveling might be the very beginning of healing. By all external measures, they've made it. They're respected, productive, and maybe even admired. They've built careers, accumulated achievements, and ticked every measurable box of success. But deep inside, something doesn't feel right. And it's not just burnout. It's something more existential. A sense of being profoundly misaligned with one's own life. Not in a dramatic, rock-bottom way, but in a quiet, persistent ache. Like you've been playing a character so long, you've forgotten your original voice. What we're describing here is a psychological pattern increasingly seen in high-achieving individuals, especially those who were once labelled gifted, talented, or too mature for their age. It's called high-functioning collapse. This collapse doesn't happen in a single moment. It unfolds in layers. The detachment layer, where tasks become robotic, days become blurred, and pleasure disappears. The dissonance layer, where they start questioning the value of their success, yet feel trapped by it. The disintegration layer, where old coping tools stop working and emotion floods in like a tsunami. They might still go to work, still smile in meetings, still make deadlines. But inside, they're falling apart in slow motion. There's a kind of pain that doesn't have a name. It doesn't scream, it simmers. And one of the most invisible forms of it is the pain of misalignment. This happens when the outer identity, the job, the reputation, the lifestyle, no longer matches the inner self. And for many smart adults, that misalignment is terrifying, because they've invested decades into becoming the person everyone expects. So when the inner voice whispers, "This isn't what I want," I feel empty. I don't recognize myself anymore. They don't know what to do with it. Instead of facing it, they often intellectualize it. They research, journal, overanalyze, anything but feel. But here's the truth. Intellectual understanding is not emotional resolution. Knowing why you feel lost doesn't help, unless you're brave enough to feel the lostness. This is where the inner collapse becomes unavoidable. Something, a breakup, a layoff, a death, or just a silent night, pulls the curtain down. Suddenly they're alone with feelings they've avoided for years. Shame, grief, envy, rage, fear. They don't know how to sit with these feelings because no one ever taught them how. They were taught how to succeed, not how to suffer. And here lies the paradox. Their strength is what kept them surviving. But now, that same strength is what prevents them from healing. They overfunction in every area of life to avoid the one thing they fear most, being vulnerable. The collapse of a smart adult is not always visible from the outside, but inside, it often includes a fractured sense of self, chronic indecision masked as perfectionism, panic attacks that feel like failure, sleepless nights filled with what ifs and what's the point. They don't know whether they're burned out or just done. Done pretending. Done people-pleasing. Done living a life that looks good but feels hollow. This is the moment where the self splits. The constructed identity they spent years perfecting versus the authentic self they don't even know how to access. And in the chasm between these selves, they start to ask, what would I be without my achievements? Do I even like the life I've built? Was I ever really choosing or just performing? What follows this collapse isn't immediate healing. It's grief. Grief for the years spent disconnecting. Grief for the childhood that was too adult too soon. Grief for the relationships lost to control, fear, or emotional avoidance. Many describe this season as falling apart, but in truth, it's the first honest contact with a real self. That self is not shiny, it's not efficient, but it's real, and it's wounded. And here's the gift of collapse. When the old self crumbles, space is made for the new one to emerge. Recovery is not a checklist, it's not a productivity hack, it's not a 5-step formula. It's slow, messy, often deeply emotional. But it always begins with permission to feel without fixing. Gentle self-inquiry rather than harsh judgment. Learning how to sit with uncomfortable emotions. Letting go of the identity that only knew how to perform. Healing is not about becoming less intelligent. It's about becoming fully human again. So what happens after collapse? That's where part 4 leads us, into the quiet rebirth of a self that doesn't need to be impressive to feel worthy, a self that chooses connection over control, authenticity over admiration, and presence over perfection. Because being smart is not the end goal. Being whole is. Wholeness doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It doesn't announce itself with applause or clarity. Instead, it begins quietly, often in the wreckage, when everything you once clung to has fallen apart, and you're left holding nothing but questions. And maybe that's the point. Because the collapse, as painful as it is, clears the space for something more honest to emerge. Not a better version of the smart kid, not a shinier identity, but a real human being, messy, confused, growing. At first, this rebirth doesn't feel like growth. It feels like being lost, like not knowing who you are without the armor of intelligence, without the applause, without the certainty that used to define you. But that uncertainty is sacred. It means you're no longer performing, you're beginning again. And beginning again means asking different questions. Not, how do I prove I'm special? But, how do I connect? Not, how do I protect my image? But, how do I show up as I am, even when I feel inadequate? Not, how do I stay safe? But, what am I willing to risk in order to grow? This is where the work begins. Letting go of the smart kid script, the grief of identity loss. The first thing many smart kids feel after the collapse isn't relief, it's grief. You might not expect that. After all, wasn't the old persona, the perfectionist, the overachiever, the secretly lonely genius, the thing that kept you trapped? Yes. But it was also the thing that kept you safe. Letting go of that identity is like losing a familiar home. Even if that home had cracks in the ceiling and the windows never really closed right, it was still the only place you knew. And now you're outside of it, shivering in the open air. You grieve things you didn't even realize you depended on. The sense of superiority that protected you from rejection. The constant pressure that gave you direction. The way people admired you, even if they didn't know you. This grief shows up in strange ways. You may find yourself exhausted even when you're doing less. You may suddenly feel jealous of others who still live in the script you're trying to escape. You may even feel like going back just to feel certain again. That's not regression. That's mourning. Because you're not just losing an identity. You're also losing the old ways you once coped, survived, and earned love. You're walking away from the illusion of control and stepping into the uncertainty of real connection. And that's terrifying, but it's also the only way forward. From smart to whole. The 6 quiet stages of real rebuilding. Rebuilding doesn't look like a Hollywood montage. There's no triumphant music or dramatic transformation. Instead, it unfolds in quiet private moments, what we might call the 6 stages of becoming whole. 1. Unlearning. You start to question everything that once earned you praise, overachieving, suppressing emotions, being the best. It feels disorienting, like letting go of a map that always led somewhere. 2. Sitting still. There's a pause, a painful in-between. You're not performing anymore, but you haven't yet learned how to simply be. This stillness can feel like failure, but it's actually the soil for real growth. 3. Feeling fully. You begin to feel long-suppressed emotions, grief, anger, loneliness, without intellectualizing or fixing them. Just feeling them is progress. 4. Reaching gently. You start testing new ways of relating, asking for help, being honest, even when it's messy, staying in the room when you want to run. 5. Rewriting narratives. Slowly, your self-story begins to change. You're no longer the smart one, but maybe the one who is present, the one who listens, the one who dares to love. 6. Rooting in wholeness. At last, you begin to experience self-worth that isn't based on being impressive, but on simply being human. You no longer perform to be loved. You connect to love. Wholeness doesn't mean healed, it means integrated. To be whole doesn't mean your wounds are gone. It means they no longer define you. It means you've stopped trying to erase your history and started learning how to live with it. Where once you tried to overcome the past by outrunning it, through achievement, perfection, or avoidance, you now begin to listen to it. You become curious rather than critical, gentle instead of judgmental. You stop expecting yourself to be unbreakable, and you begin to trust that even if you are cracked, light still comes through. Being whole is not about never feeling insecure. It's about noticing the insecurity and choosing not to obey it. It's not about always being confident. It's about knowing you'll sometimes feel small and deciding to stay in the room anyway. It's not about having all the answers. It's about finally letting yourself ask the questions. And this is the irony. The very smart kid who once relied on being impressive now becomes the adult who can sit in uncertainty without crumbling, who can admit they don't know, who can say, I'm struggling, without shame. Because true resilience isn't built on always winning. It's built on learning to stay, even when there is no applause. Not the end, but the real beginning. So, what if your loneliness wasn't proof that you're broken, but a signal that you've outgrown the life you were taught to survive in? What if the struggle you feel now isn't a failure, but a threshold? The smart child you once were did what they had to do. They became the observer, the overachiever, the one who could read a room like a language. They didn't ask for too much. They adapted. They translated approval into love. They turned sharpness into safety. But that chapter is over. You are no longer that child, and you no longer need to earn your right to exist. Wholeness begins when you choose to unlearn what made you feel lovable only when you were useful, when you stop trying to impress the world and start asking what feels true to you. It begins when you no longer measure your worth by your productivity, when you allow yourself to say, I don't know, and feel no shame, when you start letting people see you before you've cleaned everything up, when your value is no longer tied to being good at things, but being present with yourself. And slowly, in this gentle unbecoming, something extraordinary begins. You stop performing and start participating. You stop fixing and start feeling. You stop chasing and start choosing. Not from a place of fear, but from a place of freedom. And here's what freedom really looks like. Not needing to be the smartest one in the room. Not having to always explain yourself. Not filtering every sentence to make sure it sounds impressive. Not using strength to hide pain. Not using silence to avoid rejection. But simply being present, human, enough. You don't get there all at once. There is no grand arrival. Just a slow return to yourself. One truth at a time. One boundary at a time. One breath at a time. So this is not the end. It's the start of your life. Not as someone you were trained to be, but as someone you were born to be. Not perfect, not polished, not always composed, but real, rooted, and finally, free. The goal is not to be remarkable. The goal is to be real, because from realness comes the kind of love, connection, and life that no amount of intelligence can ever substitute.